Stephanie, thanks so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So I start these out. What are your current research interests? What's top of mind for you right now?
Yeah, so I'm currently studying how video is used as a tool for science communication, and specifically looking towards how students use it. So high school students, as well as like early college students, use videos for different types of science related purposes.
So what is the state of the world? Like what are your initial findings in terms of like how folks are using video or YouTube or all the different platforms? What's the snapshot that you tell people?
Oh man, that's so loaded. Because a lot of
Yeah.
it, at least what I'm personally interested also in like representation. So like as
Mhm.
well as like gender, racial representation and like the science content that we consume. And so in the state of the world, like if we think of just science media in terms of like I grew up watching a lot of PBS Saturday shows and like,
Mhm.
growing up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy and the Magic School Bus, and I feel like those were initial channels that inspired me. um and as I grew older, there's like sci-fi movies that I would watch. But now that I'm studying media and how scientists are portrayed in media, now I'm looking into like, well, all the sci-fi movies that we have always has like the male protagonist, or like the crazy uncle, from like Back to the Future, crazy uncle, white, like with white hair frizzled out, like just like super mad scientist. And we kind of play into these same stereotype tropes. And even
Mhm.
now that we're kind of not, I guess, like culturally demanding more representation and
Mhm.
diversity in the spaces that we're in, we're also seeing that like the stuff that we enjoy and grew up watching is reflected upon. It's also reflected in like what we see in the workplace when it comes to like careers in science and engineering. And so I want to see, yeah, does representation really matter to kind of increase diversity in both spaces, and how does that look like? But the scope of the world is that it's still much of the same. We're still seeing the
Mm.
same tropes, the same stereotypes. We're now pushing more, like now people are pushing back more to increase that, but it's for the media is such a big entity, and even those that create content on YouTube, it's all very self-made. So there's not really infrastructure in place to actually help push more diversity and representation into media and the sciences.
Okay, interesting. So in preparing for this, I've watched a lot of your YouTube series, which I think is really I want to make sure I get the word right. It was really honest
Mhm.
and curious and interesting. And so I'm going to ask you to tell the story about you know studying chemistry and then getting into science communication. But I'd love to hear the journey in your words,
Mhm.
um, and then also kind of what your thinking, your perspective is on the science of science communication, because I know a lot of people. Um, well, maybe we can save that as a separate question.
Okay.
Just start with your story. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
big one.
so I went out of high school, went to community college, didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. It was just very like, okay, process elimination, science would be my deal. And I chose chemistry because I enjoyed that class in high school. And I kind of followed through with that, going from community college to a four-year university, went to the University of Central Florida. I got my bachelor's in chemistry, and I'm the first person in my family to attend college. And there is some research programs on our campus where they helped low income, first generation, or considered like, underrepresented in science, to kind of like groom them to go into higher education. So I was kind of like, that's where I got my first research experience. I got to go to Boulder, Colorado to research biochemistry, realized that I hated biochemistry. And then I had
Mm,
to figure out what is it that I actually wanted to research. And I learned about inorganic chemistry, specifically like material science. So the way that atoms arrange within a space in order to create some type of material and understand those properties. fell in love with it and decided to continue to pursue my education to, so going on to graduate school to continue to do research in material science. But yeah, but like going to graduate school is a little bit of a wake up call, or maybe a
Mm,
culture shock in the sense of
mm,
I had so much support and a lot of community resources, and because I was part of this program that kind of laid out the groundwork for me when I went to grad school, it was very much kind of, hit the ground running. You got to figure it out on your own and
mm,
like the best survive in a sense.
mm,
Yeah, it just was the experience I wasn't really expecting. The first lab that I joined, I loved the research that I was doing. It was such a great lab, but I just wasn't receiving the mentorship that I needed. So that led
mhm,
me to kind of fail one of my first exams, and I made the decision to switch to a different lab to get better guidance. I switched to a different lab. I was still underneath the same type of like inorganic chemistry research, but I no longer loved the research that I was doing, even though I was in a more supportive mentoring position or space or whatever. Um, and yeah, it really affected my mental health because, I went there to kind of do chemistry. Nothing was
mhm,
going according to plan. I wasn't meeting people's expectations. I wasn't getting my expectations and like the needs that I needed met. And I
mhm,
needed an outlet. And so I turned to science YouTube as the nerd that I am.
mm,
And
mhm,
I was always into science YouTube as an undergraduate student. So I used it for for learning how to do to how to solve problems, but then also just being curious and love learning how to learn and learning
mhm,
about new topics. But I realized most of these popular science YouTubers that get like millions of views are just middle-aged white men. and like
mhm,
and I didn't and even looked into further that there were some women presenting science YouTubers that had like less likes and also were being vocal about the gender gap within the science space. And then as a Latino woman in STEM, I realized, well, there's no one that really looks like me in this space talking
mm,
about science. And then I made me reflect about the department that I was in. And there was no woman of color at the time as professors in my department, and then looked into the NSF reported statistics of like the diversity in the workplace. And
mhm,
and that was also reflected there. And so I was like, okay, like I identified a problem, or
mhm,
I identified a gap, and what can I do as an individual about it? And so like the small little step that I wanted to do was like start my own YouTube channel where,
mhm,
I'm just coming in as myself and continuing to use the research that or the science that I'm learning about in chemistry, and see if I can make a YouTube channel over it for it. And as I continue to kind of dive into this idea, that's where I learned that these science YouTubers that I looked up to and admired were actually considered science communicators. And that's for the first time that I learned that science communication was legit a field and legit something that is not only just people that make YouTube channels, like there's a legit profession out there. And that just opened my world to this new career possibility. That was very long winded, but that's kind of
no,
like the essence of my story.
I love it. I think it's great. And I think what's interesting, watching this story unfold on YouTube and a little bit on Instagram is I said honest before, but I think it's first of all, it's also brave. Like I'm also a kind of person who learns in public and kind of admits what I don't know and shares how I'm feeling and where I'm going. And but I think you're the way you're approaching it is really with a scientific mind, right?
Mhm.
Like in some way, like you seem very curious about this. And when I hear you talk about it, and kind of what kind of drew me into um, the work in general is,
Yeah.
the name of your Clubhouse channel is the Science of Science Communication. Like
Yeah.
you're really thinking about this um, with a rigorous lens. And to me, that's really exciting because I think the things that you're talking about, um, the representation issues, the this idea that science communication is a whole other like it doesn't operate on published papers and
Mhm.
tenured promotions. It
Mhm.
operates on something that's a little bit more akin to YouTube or akin to media, right? Like
Mhm.
views and branding and things like that. So it has a different incentive structure, but it's also part of the scientific um, infrastructure. So that's long-winded. I'm sorry about
No,
that.
no,
But
no, okay.
my question for you is, um, how do you define the science of science communication? How did you get into the the rigorous analysis of the field, and what's the state of that field right now?
Yeah. So, okay. So I kind of like finishing piggybacking off like the story that I told. I was met with the choice of like I didn't know studying science communication was an option. I just knew
Hmm.
like at my point of view was like if you go to a museum that's a form of science communication. If I watch the science YouTube, that's a form of science communication. If I read kind of like popular science articles, like science communication is very broad in the sense. And it wasn't until me making the decision to leave my chemistry PhD and kind of pave my own path into studying science
Hmm.
communication and technically kind of making my science YouTube idea into like a bigger dissertation project is where I started learning more about the science of science communication. Because a lot of like right there's master's programs in science communication, and there's no PhD science communication out there. It's very communications heavy, which is when we look at communications as a research topic, there's like how do people, it's very broad in the sense of okay, like how we're using it as marketing, how are people engaging with it on the internet, how we do it like in person, politics, religion, like how does that all interplay. But when it comes to the science of science communication, right now a lot of the stuff that's kind of published is very practice like
Hmm.
like there's always been a form of outreach when it comes to just science, like when it comes to science research, like aside from publishing your work, some depending on who's like getting where scientists are getting funding from, so say
Hmm.
from the National Science Foundation, NSF, aside from getting grant money to publish their work, usually some of that money or some of the incentive for them to get the grant is to do some kind of public outreach.
Hmm.
And so that outreach is, we identify as just outreach, like, oh, going to a classroom to talk about scientists or making a booth where people can engage with it,
Hmm.
or just, publishing some kind of like unrelated article. But it's not until recently that we're starting to look at like we need like legit professional people like in this
Hmm.
spaces, because scientists are already like maxed out of like all of the responsibilities they have to do aside from running a lab, finding the money for the grants, publishing their data, mentoring the students that are in their labs, and they're also expected to also have this broader impact of like how they have to be able
Hmm.
to communicate, or show the importance of how is the public going to know that this publicly funded research is also important to them. So it's
Hmm.
that in and of itself, it's its own thing, and so much of it is just kind of practice where people were just doing their own thing, and that's how it kind of worked. And so the science of science communication is now actually taking this like how do we actually approach this critically in
Hmm.
terms of like like we say that like how do we really know that our outreach or our communication efforts are truly impacting the audience that we are targeting. How can we use the how is the way that we communicate lead to either behavioral change? Is it just to inform somebody? Is it just to incite policy change? And so the science communication not only looks between like like what medium is used. So
Hmm.
is it going to be like media? Is it written? Is it conversational? Like
Hmm.
what medium is being used? What is the context of the topic? Like what are you guys
Hmm.
talking about? Um, and like are yeah, what are you trying to get the audience? Like what are you trying to get the audience to do? Like what is the outcome
Hmm.
of that? And so it's kind of like looking between these relationships
Hmm.
to really truly understand like what is how do we be specific about the message that we're trying to convey, who the person we're trying to speak to, in regards to the person who we're trying to speak to, and like what is the outcome of that conversation.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It does. I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you how I came across this. So my first introduction so I'm not a scientist. Like I didn't go through the system in the way that you went through the system, like, like grad school and things like that. I was
Mhm.
studied something else and started building tools that scientists were using,
Yeah.
underwater robots, and then got involved in, like, I came in through like a weird door. But it's so I've always been like had this kind of outsider perspective.
Hmm.
Like, no, it doesn't all make sense to me, like why people do what they do.
Hmm.
And I read this paper by Dan Kahn at Yale. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with him?
No, let him look it up soon.
Yeah, so it's Kahan, and I'm hoping to interview him. But he wrote one of the first papers I ever saw about the science of science communication, and he was drawing attention to the fact that the more people were informed on a topic, the less likely they were to agree. So like
Mm-hmm.
it even if someone didn't believe in climate change, like giving them more information wasn't necessarily going to change their mind. It was in
Hmm.
fact the opposite was going to happen. And so
Hmm.
there was this real kind of science communication paradox, almost like
Yeah.
at the heart of what we think is important.
Yeah.
And and here, like, and then meanwhile I was on the board of NOAA's ocean exploration program, and we go to these board meetings, and they would just, hey, we got this many YouTube views and this many, and that was like this real sign of success. And I had this experience, working with Nat Geo too. They're like, we have all these zillions of Instagram followers, and it's like, what is that even the right metric that we should be using? And so
Yeah.
I had all of these questions, and as soon as you start scratching the surface of this, like, you realize, like, this is a this is a whole area of, like, not only rigor that we need to add to this, but there are really big questions that we
Yeah.
need to ask too.
Yeah.
And so I think it's fascinating, and it's been fun to watch your, because you're kind of taking it, you've got this community that people are excited. So um sorry, this is again long-winded. my
No, it's
my
okay.
question.
I just started thinking about like, oh my God, David, I totally remember your question during a Clubhouse that I had with like Susanna or Virginia
That's
or something
right.
like
That's right. Yeah.
that.
So, I mean, so have you had any chance to think about that? Like, what is I asked what the right metrics were, because I was convinced that, like, YouTube
Yeah.
views and Instagram followers is not the right metric. What metrics should we be looking at for science communication?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to like it's so case by case, which is frustrating because there's not like a general thing that we can be measuring. Because again, like I think what you were saying before, or what I had some of the conversations on my Clubhouse is like, okay, there's either we go to a museum, we tell someone a science fact, and that's like, oh yeah, I impacted this person. But it's like, how do you truly know that we like change their mind? Or is it
Hmm.
that we do want to change their mind? Is that what we're trying to identify? And that's something that we're like me and my other science communication friends are actually studying science communication. Like that is the ultimate question, because it's
Hmm.
like and it's so different depending on where you're reaching your audience. So for example, my friend who is studying um, she's currently researching how filmmakers approach measuring the impact of the films that they make.
Hmm.
So is the incentive to change minds? Like, how do you measure that through a video? Is it just to increase knowledge or awareness about a certain topic? Or you want like what is it that you want these filmmakers? What is it that they want their audience to leave with after watching a video? And
Hmm.
she's been coming to the terms of like a lot of these filmmakers are simply just doing it for fun because it excites them personally without
Hmm.
having the bigger goal or having like the not bigger goal but like just having the goal to like change someone's mind. Like they're doing
Hmm.
it because they're just interested in the topic itself and just want to share their excitement. And that
Hmm.
could be like there's it's kind of hard to measure that excitement unless the only way that we can measure that is if they post it on YouTube. Again, they have the likes, the way that they engage with the comments, or how people engage with the comments, if it's shared more. But that's still not like a very person to person type of metric unless they have some kind of survey,
Hmm.
where they administer the survey to their audience and then they give them direct feedback or provide testimonials exactly how this video was impacted. It's kind of hard to get to that individual level when we're using such a big platform such as YouTube as like a metric of impact. And I
Hmm.
think that's kind of where, like, so is it up to science communicator researchers to create that survey tool that maybe these filmmakers can start implementing into the videos that they published? Do these filmmakers even care
Hmm.
to want to know about the impact?
Yeah.
But I think that's completely different than like, um, okay, say for instance, my research. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to see if science videos can truly be, not truly be, can science videos be used as a tool to motivate students to pursue a career in STEM?
Hmm.
Motivation is kind of hard to like, kind of hard to truly gather from just like a survey, but it's just like, I'm personally trying to see if there is kind of some kind of mental change or a change in perspective after watching this video. And I have to design a survey and meet with these students kind of one-on-one to get that impact. But that's not going to be scalable if I'm wanting to create like a global media company
Hmm.
through my little, not my little, they're my little business. Yeah, I guess my little business of Phuture Doctors.
Hmm.
And kind of collect user feedback. And I don't know where I was going with this conversation. It's just like, it is the ultimate question. We have to kind of stray away from like the superficial analytics of the YouTube likes, or just view counts as like a form of impact, but it really depends on what is it that you're trying to get. Like, is it just to inform? Is it just to like, are you just trying to inform, or are you actually trying to create behavioral change in the person? And how do we really capture behavioral change after just exposing one type of content
Yeah.
to the audience? And so I don't know, that's the ultimate research question that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, no, totally. I think there's a ton of really interesting research questions to be had. Um, One of my favorite books, and this is just kind of an aside, and then I have another question, and I bring this up all the time, is I interviewed Paula Stefan, who's a science economist, and she wrote this wonderful book called How Economics Shapes Science. And
Mhm.
it's like this really great look at all the incentives that are pulling on scientists and why they act how they act. And I think a similar kind of book could be written, like how economics shapes science communication, right?
Yeah.
Like, where does the money flow? Who gets paid? Why are people, why do people do what they do? And what are those impacts on how the public perceives science, understands science? I think it's like it's a
Yeah.
whole separate book. I would love to see it, because reading her book was just like, oh my gosh, of course this is like this. Like, these are the incentives we've set up.
Yeah.
Um, Anyways, so that's an aside, maybe a different project, but I have a sense, and I could be wrong, and I'd love your opinion on this, that there was maybe a generation ago, 20, 25 years ago, science communication was kind of a thing, but it was a kind of looked down upon from scientists, like, oh, science communication, like, I have to make time to talk to a journalist who's going to communicate my results, or,
Mhm.
that's something that the Discovery Channel does. And, you
Mhm.
know, like, even like when Carl Sagan started doing, kind of pioneered some of this stuff, or Jacques Cousteau or whatever,
Mhm.
um, like, they were looked down upon from the scientific community. They're like, oh, that's different. That's not science. And now I look around and I see a generation of scientists who don't feel that way, a
Mhm.
younger generation who actually understands a responsibility and an importance of taking that communication aspect seriously.
Mhm.
And they're using all the tools they have, whether that's
Mhm.
YouTube, whether that's Instagram, whether it's Twitter,
Mhm.
whether it's Clubhouse.
Yeah.
They're finding ways. They're the first onto these platforms, trying to figure out how to do it. Whether it's effective, we can ask that question.
Mhm.
Like, that's something we should think about. But it seems to me that there is a different generation now. Is that true? And should we be hopeful? And what else should we take from that?
I'm hopeful about it just because I'm in it too. But I think that's something like, again, like it wasn't until my second year of graduate school, of like
Hmm.
me already being in school for so long, that I learned that science communication was a legit thing. Because yeah, I did grow up watching this, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Carl Sagan, like we just saw them as kind of like, oh, this is just a paid host, like a paid scientist to like talk about their science. But never really, I don't know, at least for me, I never really personally combined that as like, oh no, he's a science communicator. Like it's just kind of, I don't know if it's just a new terminology or whatnot, but also didn't really aspire like, oh, if I become a scientist, I can be on TV to talk about it. It's just like, no, this is like, you know, this is TV, this is an actor or whatnot. But I think now with the internet, like seeing the social currency and the importance of kind of like, of the importance of how we find information now, like a lot of it is through social media, through Instagram and Twitter and whatnot. And just seeing like the bigger scope of, it's so easy now to share information. And if we do have research that, you know, could be publicly funded or whatever, like why do we like universities have to pay to publish their paper and then have to pay to like access their journals, and then, you know, it's up to journalists who like not always have a science background to like report on that science. And, you know, maybe I can see where like they're looked down upon because it's like, you know, there's sensationalism, there's editorializing the words that we're saying to like, or they, you know, they misreport. Like I was looking at the link that you sent me about like the Vox thing, about like what is the thing? The 7 biggest problems facing science according to 270 scientists. And yeah, and it's just like I agree with everything that's kind of made in this point where, you know, we still don't have the incentive to report about our science, but I think the younger generation is growing up on the internet, realizes the value of being on the internet and sharing the work that we're doing, and honestly being transparent about the work that we're doing as a form to kind of build trust. But you know, it's a fine line that we're working towards, because with pretty infographics that we present on Instagram, that, you know, we have people still sharing pseudoscience and misinformation with the same type of pretty infographics. So so, you know, when we're talking about, you know, effectiveness, like how do we make sure we're not adding to the noise, and we can be a trustworthy source of information, but we also have like the bigger scope of things, like we're still people that make mistakes. So like how do we not add to the fire sometimes that is all like the massive information that we're being consuming and also putting out there. But again, like, I don't know, again, I just feel like we're in a time where there's so many platforms where people can be present in. So why not, instead of letting pseudoscientists or like misinformation being spread by accounts that don't really know, and using the voice of scientists who are actually doing the thing and can really inform, like, no, I'm personally doing this science experiment, this is how it's set up, this is how it's working, you know, and be transparent about how the mechanics of the research works. I think we can find a way to give credit back to scientists, like, because back in the day, not back in the day, like Einstein was like a popular figure, but now it's like we have celebrities talking about science, and we're trusting like celebrities to make the decisions for us. And it's like, well, why can't we just bring that trust back into scientists? So I think it's just, I think we're, as a younger audience, we're just realizing the value of our digital currency and taking up space in this, and trying to change the narratives, and take charge of that.
Yeah, it makes good sense.
Does it really? I just feel like I rambled.
No, it does. I mean, I think the way I interpret it is, not only are these questions really interesting, like how economics shapes SciComm, and you know how these representation questions that you're asking, or the motivation questions, the metric questions, are all really, I think these are all compelling research questions that could make scientific careers.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
And we're living in a time where now we have whatever the percentage of the country has real vaccine hesitancy, right? So science is racing ahead and creating vaccines in record time, and yet a good percentage of people in the United States aren't going to take it because they don't trust science and they don't understand it. And So not only is it really interesting, it's also really important.
Mm-hmm.
And so I too am kind of afraid, but also hopeful. And the hope, the 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 reasons I'm hopeful are actually because of folks like you who are like not trying to get caught up in um, or just kind of staying curious about the question and just trying to get to better and better questions about this, because I still think we're like at the very beginning of understanding how to do this.
Yeah.
So I'd love to switch. I've got lots of more questions, but I'd love to switch to the research mode to see how you're visualizing this, how you're thinking about this, how you see the world.
Yeah, I think or just real quick, I just want to
Yeah.
say science communication is I think now, because we're seeing the importance of it, it's now taking a little bit more seriously rather than just like, oh, these are just journalists that report on science. Like, no, like scientists, we're not directly trained to communicate, only just to other technical people in our field. And if we are, how can we change the incentive to make the public facing portion of our research and actually have that as a legit career path rather than just like a freelancing type of thing, or something that we do on the side for fun rather
Hmm.
than the research that we're doing. And so I don't know. Yeah, I'm hopeful because it is emerging. That means there is space for more people to start thinking about these questions and actually doing the research behind it. And hopefully now we can get, at least for me, like the biggest struggle I find is finding financial support to continue this research or
Hmm.
continue like science communication as like a legit job um, um, instead of something I do for fun for as an academic.
Hmm.
But yeah, so okay. So this was such an interesting question of like how I go about my research process. I think again, my research process was very personally driven in the sense that I as a consumer of media, this is the gap that I saw in this media. So that's what kind of drives my main question is like, can uh, my audience, if I'm as my audience is going to be young adults, so like early college students and high school students, um, if I'm meeting I'm trying to meet where my audience is at, and if most audiences or most college or young adults are going to be on social media or using YouTube as kind of like their TV,
Hmm.
then I'm interested in TV or YouTube as like my medium.
Hmm.
Um, and then again, like I personally want to create videos as like that's like what I want to do when I grow up. I want to make
Hmm.
videos full time about science. My overall arching question is, can videos be used as a tool to motivate students to consider or, increase their interest into STEM or consider a career in STEM?
Hmm.
So I wanted to produce 2 science videos. Um, and I wanted to see if we're so a lot of things in science communication, it's kind of cheesy, but we have like, oh, we have to tell a story. We use stories to kind of captivate our audience.
Hmm.
We That's how we remember things.
Hmm.
It's a way that we communicate that's been passed down for generations of like exchanging stories. And so
Hmm.
how do we entice people through the stories that we're telling about science? Can it be used as a way to kind of like, bring them in? And also, can we change, like, would there be a change in behavior after the story is being told?
Hmm.
Makes me think of like what you were mentioning before about like just telling people more information doesn't change their mind.
Hmm.
There is this thing called like the deficit model, where in communication, where we had the
Sure.
preconceived notion that like, oh, if we just tell them, like if they're not educated in this, so we just have to educate them and then they'll know what to do. And it's like, no, it's not how it works. We have to also um consider like, what are they bringing to the table? What knowledge do they have? What preconceived beliefs
Hmm.
do, or whatever beliefs or identities that they're bringing to the table, and how do we meet halfway to have this this exchange of talk, like exchange about science?
And the deficit model is still the dominant mode of thinking amongst scientists, and
Yeah.
even I would say science communication, like media. They
Yeah.
still think that that's the way that we need to do it.
Even though there's now published articles that are like, we're not
Exactly.
doing this anymore. Like, we're doing
Yeah.
this instead. Like, I think
Right.
now we're pushing towards like the dialogue again. Like, what,
Hmm.
like, just because you don't know something doesn't mean that you have something of value to, to bring into the scientific knowledge. And so,
Hmm.
um, So yeah, so I think, oh damn, I was confused. Okay, so my main goal was to kind of first make these 2 videos that I'll be testing, um, that I'll be presenting to these students to evaluate like which kind of content would they be interested in consuming. So there's 2 different like storytelling narratives I'm exploring. So the first narrative is simply about the science, like just them learning about this scientist research and how the research works. Can that be used is that what motivates them to want to consider a potential career in science, or is it learning about the scientists themselves and like their, whatever their journey looks like, are there, can I capture like their characteristics of the scientists, and do students identify or relate to the scientists that they see because they're learning about the story and see them as a person? Like, so I'm really interested in if one kind of motivates more than the other, or is it both, a little bit of both, or is it neither? Like they're just there because they were told to do this survey. So I so that was kind of like my main thesis question that I'm looking into. So the next step is, okay, now I have to make these videos, and I wanted to find again, kind of like my underlying mission, my underlying motivation from like my personal self is, again, representation is important to me. So the scientist that I'm featuring in the videos is going to be a woman of color. So I have a Black woman, a biomedical engineer who is a friend on campus. Love her. She was like my little model. And I went about going through like the production process of like producing a video, these 2 different types of videos. And so I would visit her in lab, just had an informal interview with her, just had like a tape recorder, just learned about herself as like her story, like how she got into science, what motivated her to go into science, and then about her actual research. Like I don't know anything about her research, so it's also important for me in the science communicator hat to make sure that like I'm not going to misrepresent the research that she's presenting, and how do I make sure that like if I'm trying to, I don't know, simplify is never the right word, but if I'm trying to like recontextualize her research to make it more understandable to high school students, like how do I make sure that I'm actually, whatever metaphors and analogies I'm using are actually legit, like they're not going to be more confusing.
Totally.
So I have this informal interview with her. And then, okay, I'll show you kind of like what that looks like. Let's see. All right, I'm going to share my screen.
Cool.
So yeah, so these are my notes. I transcribe our interview. So I use a program called Otter. I transcribe our entire interview. And from there, I try to pick up common themes. So like, at what point was she talking about her science? At what point was she talking about her personal drive? And we'll start categorizing that and trying to structure out like what would be like the structure of the story if I have 5 minutes to talk about her science, or like 5 minutes to talk about her personal journey. And so I kind of like brainstorm what that looks like. Use kind of like her quotes to guide the story that I'll be telling. And then I visit her again in person, and I conduct like the in-person interview again, make sure that I have the questions that I want to include into my video. I'm asking those questions again in lab. And then I just capture footage of her working in the lab, doing science stuff and whatnot. And so after I capture the in-person interview and capture like footage of her working in the lab, then it comes back to, now I have to actually outline what my video will look like. And so this is kind of like an AV table. So this will be like what I'm actually going to be said in the video on one hand, and then like what is going to be visually represented on the other hand. So I start piecing together, like I have this footage of what Corey was talking about in her science, but to fill the gaps, to carry out to carry out the story, then is it going to be a voiceover with animations, or is it going to be me as like a host to present, to carry, like be a facilitator of carrying that narration? So after I do kind of like the video script, then I already have the footage and I have the script, and I go ahead and just edit that using like Adobe Premiere as
Hmm.
my video editing platform. And then I have a final video to share.
Awesome.
So after, I don't know if I want to show a clip or not, or I can mute
Yeah, you
it.
can show. Yeah, show a little bit. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay, so for example, I have like the introduction. I put like so the scientist researches prostate cancer.
Hmm.
And so before going into some of the footage of the interview that I had of Dr. Grayson, I have to set up the story. So like we wrote like, so meet Zach. Zach's body is functioning normally. His cells are replicating in a precise and orderly fashion, following a set of signals in the cell growth cycle. But today, one of Zach's cells is about to mutate, causing it to grow out of control, ultimately leading to a deadly cancerous tumor in his prostate. And so we propose like, okay, maybe at this point we'll have like a drawing of a dude, like a cell pops up and they're dividing, like, so we kind of really lay out what that animation looks like, which I ended up bringing to life through my video edits.
Meet Zach. Zach's body is functioning normally. His cells are replicating in a precise and orderly fashion following a set of signals in the cell growth cycle. But today, one of Zach's cells is about to mutate, causing it to grow wildly out of control, ultimately leading to a deadly cancerous tumor in his prostate.
There are 4 stages of prostate cancer, starting with stage 1. In stage 1, the doctor identifies that there's a tumor within the prostate. When it comes to stage 4, the cells of the prostate kind of break up and travel throughout the body. So the cancer spreads throughout the body and it goes to either the bones,
You did all
the
these
lymph
graphics?
nodes, or other organs. For stages 1 through 3,
This is B-roll.
the
Those
cancer
two,
is
but the
actually
initial
treatable through
like
surgery,
animation is what
radiation,
I
or hormone
made.
therapy.
Okay.
And then
But
the other one was like
treatment
stock
options become
footage.
so limited
Awesome.
when the patient presents as stage 4 prostate cancer.
Especially with an African American men, they don't always present at stage 1. They usually present at later stages with more aggressive forms. So that is actually what's being presented in clinic. So how can we treat those stages in these cases? And so in my research, I'm hoping to, I don't want to say cure, but I want to provide them more treatment options.
All right. So I guess for like in setting, so this is like my story, like my science centered video. So it's very all about this, like all about the prostate cancer research. I'm bringing on Dr. Grayson as like my expert, who just happens to be a Black woman in science. And then for the remaining of the video is kind of like she explains to me what her research is about, like how the tools that she's using to kind of solve this problem. And I'm using my animation and like me as a host to kind of like, okay, like she said this is how this actually, like, this is how it looks like, and throughout the narration.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So, it's really well done. And I think, like if you go on the Science Better videos, I just post these recordings. I don't do much editing, like it's like not well done. But to me, that's okay. Like I feel like some people just want the information. But my question is, okay, so like all of these, there's a lot of science YouTube going on right now. And would you say most folks are like you, self-taught, creating these visuals? Like they're actually individuals doing all this, or are there teams? Like what's the breakdown of how those videos are getting created?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like 3 different entities in a sense, where we have
Okay.
like individual content creators
Mhm.
that are kind of self-taught or already have like some kind of like media background that make their science videos. And then there's like the content creators that eventually get picked up by like organizations, so they're able to form a team, or they have like
Mhm.
enough of a following or generate enough revenue from the videos that they make to start, building a team out, to start getting external help, but they're still like the sole brains behind the work. And then
Mhm.
and then there's
The produced stuff, like Nat Geo produces something
yeah,
or something like
exactly.
that.
Then there's like institutions themselves, like,
Yeah.
like Nat Geo, or like university institutions that have a communications and media department to produce the video, like to produce videos like that.
Got it.
And then there's like kind of like Seeker, which is like a digital media company, starts producing their like producing their own, like Seeker and Vox are kind of like the main ones that I can think about that they're not big like Nat Geo, but they're not centered around a sole content creator. They're just kind of like a small production company producing content based around science.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I'm watching those with interest to see if it's viable, right? Like to see if they can bring like the digital know-how to science communication and kind of I because my feeling is there are a ton of really talented people like yourself included who are actually really getting good at this, you know, and deserve a better situation than the kind of the deals that are being offered by popular science television channels now. Like I don't necessarily think those are good deals, especially for people who are bringing their own audiences. I mean, I think we're seeing this in journalism and in music and media. It's like if you have the audience, like you should be in control.
Yep.
So it's going to be so interesting to see how this all plays out. That's cool. Okay.
No, go ahead. I just had a conversation, my last Clubhouse that I had. She is she forms a science communication business, and she called it at first. It was her initial launch, I guess. Her initial business idea was just to do simply filmmaking, but then adapting to what the scientists actually need. And she ended up changing it to kind of like a creative agency. So she kind of helps scientists brand. Like scientists don't really have like, a lot of the websites that scientists have are just like whatever's on the institution, just like a quick bio and whatnot. So she helps kind of like the scientists brand themselves like by, updating their website, creating new graphics and images centered around like the research that they're doing, and pretty much help them up their social media presence to eventually be able to kind of work build that audience. So then if they do make a film, that they actually have an audience to show for the film instead of just making a film. But these are scientists that no one has ever heard about or, or like know about their research. But it was so hopeful with that conversation because like, I sometimes feel a little bit discouraged because like, there's still some resistance. Like we know that, we know there, when scientists write grants, there has to be some kind of broader impact component to the grants that they're writing. So like like how are they going to share the research to the public? But again, scientists are stretched thin and they're not given like additional funding to do this publicly outward action. So if they have the option to put more money into their research or to do like this outreach thing, they're going to want to use that money towards their research. And so some of the outreach efforts are very like, can I cuss on here? Like, I don't know. They're very like, okay. They're very like half-assed, So when I was talking to Kika's her name, when I was talking to Kika about her business, she was saying how she's optimistic because like, there's so many scientists out there who don't do science communication well. And now we actually have a new generation of people that want to do science communication legitly, that have the skills and talents to help them, shape the communication that they're trying to do or start building their publicly outward experience. So hopefully that kind of like incentivizes, or starts building more infrastructure in place to support like scientists to kind of like contract us out to do the work instead of like taking away from like the research funding itself. And so I don't know, but yeah, it makes me hopeful too, because it's just like I wasn't taught any of these things. Like all this stuff was just kind of like out of my self accord because like I believe in it. I felt like I just loved it. I loved it a little bit more than actually doing like chemistry research at the bench. And now that I'm like going to be graduating soon with my PhD, it's, I am part of I'm part of the people that are kind of pioneering the space to continue to build up some type of like place where future grad students can leave and know that they have a place to work at and not just like be scared of like this freelancing landscape that only seems to exist, or like science journalism that like as the only option as a form of science communication.
Right.
Um,
Which
I don't know.
is interesting because that's almost like this like literary thing, right? Like it's like it. Anyways, okay, that's just so cool, and I think that like I was talking before, something I really admire is you're approaching all of this, honestly, transparently, bravely, and curiously. Like you're
Mhm,
asking bigger and bigger questions.
mhm,
I also love the aspect of this that is so entrepreneurial, right? Like
mhm,
you're having to figure out how to pay for this. And
mhm,
like, okay, I've started a business and
mhm,
I'm not maybe not totally off the academic track, but like I have to figure that out. And I think
mhm.
that's a really the way so far the way you've talked about it, the way you've approached it is again being really curious and transparent about it. And I think that's important because I think you're pioneering new ground.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. Like I would love to read like that idea, that how economics shapes science communication. Like I'm really
Yeah.
curious. There was a book that just came out called something about maintenance. I was Stripe Press, but it was like this snapshot about how open source software developers make money. Like how do we actually
Mm,
support that whole big economy of open source software? And everybody's
mhm,
got different tactics, and it's really interesting and it's really important. And I'd
mhm.
love to like see like like a similar kind of landscape of like how people are making money in science communication and
Yeah.
like how people are running their businesses because I think it's really compelling. Anyways, I think you're doing a great job with that too.
Yeah. Thanks.
Um, so the question I always end on is is kind of it's kind of cheesy, but people always have good answers, and you've given me a ton. But what are your specific ideas or idea to make science better? What would you improve?
Yeah, I think again, kind of just harping on like there needs to be like science communication needs to be taken seriously. It shouldn't just be an afterthought after the research is done. Like it should be incorporated into the scientific inquiry and making sure like if we're going to try to be transparent about the work and continue to rebuild or I don't know, rebuild, but continue to build that trust between the public and science, like we have to have people that are legitly trained to communicate science to be this person to facilitate those conversations because um you know again if like scientists aren't trained to specifically talk to the public unless they're passionate about it and go out of their way to do it, but there's no incentive for them to do it aside from just meeting a quota of like, yes, I did some form of outreach with the research that I got funded. And then we have science journalists who like some are like the more that they report about science, the more they learn, they become science people and learn about science and understand it. But I think as like, you know, at least for me personally, like graduate students, we're just always taught or like always kind of like have this narrative of like it's either industry or academia. Like I think science communication is a valid, legit approach, and we can be those people that have actually carried out the scientific method, understand it. So how do we take that knowledge and those experiences to kind of be more open about like this is how science works and this is what's happening in real time, so we're not freaking out when we get new information, but now can be those people like, no, this is how it's laid out, this is what's happening, this is where it's going, and not add to like the sensationalism that we can with like the media that's being posted. um and yeah, just be honest and transparent and direct, so then we're able to continue to facilitate these conversations. So I feel like, I don't know. Yeah, I feel like if there's just more incentive to incorporate contracting out professional science communicators, I think it can help alleviate some of the gaps that we've had, and problems that have accumulated over time.
Oh, it sounds great. I like it. It's a great idea. Well, Stephanie, thanks so much. I really appreciated it, and yeah, I look forward to following along.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I had a really good time.